Thank you very much to Devika there for that lovely introduction, and good morning to you all. It's so wonderful to be here at Jaipur with this amazing panel. It's an amazing panel that actually has some history though, because Namita, you're on stage now with two people that you've collaborated with and have been friends with over the years. Tell us a little about your relationship with both of our panelists here.
Putting my phone on silent.
She's putting her phone on silent.
I'm here on the stage with three people I've collaborated with.
That's true.
Because I've worked a lot with Georgina as well, 2 long interviews, and she's also helped out with the Jaipur Literature Festival in London at the British Library and been such a valuable ally to us. Ravi Singh, what do I say? I met Ravi Singh when we were both much younger in 1998, and he did an absolutely very stern and very beautiful edit of my novel, The Book of Shadows, which is a ghostly novel and very difficult to structure, but he worked on doing that, and that's when our friendship began. And he's been one of my most valued friends and editors. And then there is Lucy. Lucy was in Belfast in our lovely JLF festival, where we were in a session, was it Four Mothers? Yeah, in 2019. And we've been together on the jury of the Dylan Thomas Prize. And we've read together, we've spoken together already in these two. And then she was at the British Library again in 2023. Although I'm much older, the spheres of our writing overlap quite a lot. She writes long fiction and short fiction. She also writes stage and radio drama. And I've worked on short stories, hope to write some more. And I've written a play called Betrayed by Hope in collaboration with Dr. Malashri Lal. So we are both a bit adventurous and seeking new forms. So I think it's wonderful to be here. We've called it the long and the short, because I'm always puzzled about my attitude to short stories. I had told myself I will only work on short stories because my mind doesn't have the capacity anymore with doing too many things, or maybe just getting older, to hold a whole novel in my head for a year or two. But at the same time, as you will find out in the course of the conversation, there are huge challenges in doing short form. And can I break protocol and do a spot survey?
Absolutely.
How many of you write short stories? Okay. How many of you write long fiction? And just a vote, first vote, which of you prefer long fiction? And which of you prefer short fiction? Okay, so
pretty
it's
even.
an engaged audience.
I mean, it's hard though, isn't it? I mean, Lucy, tell us what the short story means to you.
Yeah, thank you, Georgina, and thank you. It's wonderful to be here to talk about this with you. I was writing short stories for 10 years before any of them worked. By that point, I had published 3 novels, written several stage plays and radio dramas, and I could not get a short story to work. It would always seem, I'd finish it, and it would seem less than the sum of its parts. It would be desiccated. It would be, so what? And I was trying to write things that I thought had a good plot. I was trying to write things that I thought were a good moment, and none of them were more than the sum of themselves. None of them unfurled in the reader. None of them continued to reverberate and exist after the story finished. And slowly I began to realize some of the ways in which I was going wrong. The short story started working for me when I started seeing it as words and rhythms in a particular order to conjure up a mood, like a spell. I started thinking of my short stories as spells, not as plots at all. And I was writing at the time young girlhood and young womanhood, and so capturing this intensity of feeling seemed to work really well. And I started realizing as well that we quite often talk about the short story as a moment, and that's not enough. It's not a moment at all. There's, to use one of Namita's beautiful stories to illustrate this, Namita has a story in her new collection about the day that Princess Diana died. So Namita takes this global moment, and to that moment, she uses that moment to look at what it means on a global scale, what it means, that iconic image of the Taj Mahal. She looks at what it means from a colonial perspective. She looks at what it means from an intimate perspective. She looks at what it means for a romantic life, for an intimate life. She looks at what it means between friends. And so I think what I slowly began to realize is that you don't just write a moment, you take a moment and you bring to bear on it pressures of the personal, of the political, of the intimate, of past, present, future. And if you do this well enough, it's like you bring all these pressures to bear on something and then you have a diamond. Then you have something semi-precious. And it took me a long time to have enough skill, I think, to make my short stories work.
And so, Namita, what does it mean for you to polish that diamond till it's shining in your collection?
You know, Ravi will tell you, I don't spend much time polishing the diamonds in my collection. And sometimes he helps. But the only thing I can do is put it away for some time and then read it again and see if it passes muster the next time. And frankly, if I had to read The Day Princess Diana Died, I might have removed it from that anthology. Because I'm not critical, I just get sick of my own writing very quickly. And I don't remember anything I've ever written. I don't remember the names, the characters, the plots. And I can't bear to read these stories again. So I've come here, I'll wing it on every other thing, on my thoughts, my emotions. But you ask me a lot about these stories, I just forget. And maybe that's why I can be so prolific, because I can blank out and move to the next one. So I don't go back and polish. I go back and polish my novels a lot. That's different. You know, it's a long narrative. You've got to say, okay, I can drop this bit, I can drop that bit. But when I write a short story, I just write it in that moment, and then I can correct the grammar, or a sentence can be made prettier. But I don't remember ever working on the structure of a short story, where I do try to work endlessly on the structure of a novel or even a novella.
So, Ravi, Namita described your editing process as stern. She said you gave her a very stern edit. So tell us about the process then of editing a short story and how that differs from editing something more long form.
Well, to be honest, I haven't really thought about the difference. It is really, I think it's the same sensibility and the same investment that you bring to editing, whatever, it could even be non-fiction. I think very few editors in their head would tell themselves, this is non-fiction, this is long form, this is short form, therefore we're going to do things differently. Because when you read it, you just, the ideal situation, and I think, most editors who love what they're doing are in that ideal situation, is that soon enough you begin to inhabit the world that the writer has created, whether it is a short story, a novel, or a work of non-fiction. And then it is just intuition that takes over, your connection with the sensibility of the writer. If you're lucky, you share that to such an extent that sometimes, Namita said this to me, I just said that, can you just make a little change here? And then she said, look, and she said she's impatient. She said, look, no, I can't do it, you just do it. I said, I'm not a writer. So she said, yeah, suggest something. So I said, maybe something like this. And she said, but that's how I think, how I write. So that I was really flattered when she said that. So anyway, that's a long way, basically, of saying that there really is no difference. You don't bring a different set of tools.
What's your process when you're editing a short story?
Well, first of all, you read it through, and if it is strong enough, if it affects you, if it moves you, then you're able to spot the areas where something was a little off. It wasn't as strong enough. It didn't hold you. Well, actually, a short story, if it doesn't hold you throughout, it is a bad short story, because it's not a novel which, where you can have passages where, the effect is not the same, but it'll pull you back into its embrace a few pages later. A short story, I think, just has to hold you throughout. But still, so therefore maybe it's easier then to say, okay, here it has failed a bit, it's lost me, and so yeah, I suppose that's where, or some character, is a little off sometimes, or the language isn't as intense or strong as in, it's difficult unless. It's difficult to give you general rules for editing anything, especially short stories. It's difficult.
I mean, I know, Lucy, you work really closely with your editor at Faber. Tell us how that works.
Yeah, I'm lucky to have worked with the same editor at Faber for almost 15 years now. He's a wonderful editor. He's the editor of Nobel laureate Kazuo Ishiguro. He edits Sebastian Barry. He has a brilliant roster of Irish authors. And we have a wonderful working relationship where I'm quite a private writer. I will work and work and work at a story before I send it to him. I will probably send it to maybe a trusted reader before that, before I give it to Angus. When I give it to Angus, this is a position I'm very lucky to be in, he will edit it straight away. Sometimes it takes, a couple of days, but he will always work on it straight away. And I'm always really grateful for that, because I think so much of the short story, as Namita said, it's about that intensity, and you need to capture something. And Angus, he will work on my stories with me while they're still malleable, while they're still like Quicksilver, while it's still possible to make changes. And he edits in quite an old-fashioned way. He writes in pencil in the margins and scans a PDF and sends it back. And sometimes he will cut things. I always hone back and back and back till the story is as taut and the minimum that it can be. Like a poem, everything in a story has to be working together. And sometimes Angus will say, he might just say, I'm not sure about this, or do you need this, or is this working? He tends not to be prescriptive. He tends to leave it to me to solve things. Occasionally he might say something like, sorry, the children's names annoy me. And I know that if he's getting annoyed by the children's names, the story as a whole isn't working, because you shouldn't be noticing that kind of thing. And we will go back and forth a little bit until we both feel the story is as tight as it can be.
And Namita, I mean, it is then, I think the consensus seems to be harder to write a short story than it is to do long form.
I think both of us agreed on that. You begin a novel, you can put it away, you can go back to it. One of my novels, Things to Leave Behind, which won me the Sahitya Academy Award, which is a big deal in India. It took me almost 12 years to write it. And I carried it around like a bag of knitting here and there, and picked it up and put it away, and it didn't hurt it so much. I had a good editor there also, sadly not Ravi, but we pieced it together. But in a short story, as Ravi said, it's working. If it doesn't work, then it's something is wrong, because it's what she said about the rhythm. It has to have a rhythm and an internal rhythm and consistency. It's like and in this particular collection of stories, Life in Mars, which Ravi has edited, there were some of my older stories, and I was amazed at how immediately, when Ravi was going through them, he could point out which of them were weak and which of them needed work and how. So this is actually a collection of new stories, because they've all been worked on. And he knew that this is the point. And I said, that never struck me, that this is what's wrong with this story. And another thing I'll share with the audience is, I don't know how many editors manage to do this, but I know Ravi Singh can mimic my voice perfectly. So sometimes when he's corrected it, I don't know if he's written it or I've written it. I really don't have a clue. And I'm not the only privileged one. There was a very famous Indian writer called Khushwant Singh. And Ravi was Khushwant Singh's editor for years. And Khushwant Singh wrote some really strange passages, I have to say. He was a great writer, but more on the strange passages another time. And Ravi would correct them. And I don't think he ever really realized that they had been rewritten. So I think one thing about some editors is they just pick up.
No, I think, I let you entertain that idea. A lot of it is your writing. It's just that you forget, as you said. No, really, but I just wanted to intervene, if I may. And I've been lucky, because how many years has it been now? Over 25 years that, we worked closely. even books that I haven't published, because we're friends, we discuss it. So, how important is it for you? Have you had that chance of having an editor whom you worked with or who has been your editor for years? And is there a difference necessarily in what they bring, or someone like that would bring to your work, than a first-time editor who's reading you for the first time?
That's such a good question, Ravi. And I think when you're working with an editor, you come to know the way that you work. And so Angus can tell what I'm trying to do, and he can tell, it's a really useful course correction. And he can also say to me, I was asked to contribute to an anthology of noir stories a few years ago. And I said, and Angus also runs a crime list at Faber, and I said to Angus, I've been asked to write this for this anthology of noir, but I declined because I'm not a crime writer. And he said, no, you should give it a go. I think you would really be good at it. Go and do it. And so I gave it a go, and I managed to write a story that I really enjoyed about a teenager who's obsessed with her teacher in school, and the tricky balance of that relationship. And that was an instance where Angus, I would have said, no, I don't think I could write this kind of thing, but my editor there encouraged me. So I think that relationship is really valuable. I love Namita's image of the bag of knitting as the novel. And I think you do tend to get that with all great short story writers especially, they have these wonderful images. My favourite image of the short story is by the great Irish writer Mary Lavin. She's not so much read these days, but when Alice Munro arrived in Ireland, Alice Munro said, I'm honoured to be in the country that produced Mary Lavin. And Mary Lavin calls a short story an arrow in flight. And I love that.
I think that's beautiful. That's really, it is an arrow in flight.
And it's the purity of it and the intensity of it. And, Chekhov calls it like a shot of vodka. And the Irish writer Kevin Barry, he calls it a high wire act. And if the rope, you're walking along, and if the rope goes slack for a second, you fall. And I think this is the same as a novel. It requires the commitment of days and weeks and months and years. And even as a reader, I think you're reading a novel, and you're delayed on your commute into work, and you can read a few chapters longer. You read a bit in the bath one evening, you read a paragraph and fall asleep, you flip back the next night to see where you left off. A short story isn't like that at all. You need to, I think, write a short story and read a short story on its own terms, with that intensity, with that purity.
It is so much more unforgiving. Both the reader is more unforgiving, and when you write, if the person who's written it, if they reread it, and I really do want to write only short stories now, maybe perhaps a novella, but not even that, only because the joy and intensity of writing it will give me a kick, rather than just slaving through a novel while doing the Jaipur Lit Fest or being with my with my grandchildren, other things. So I loved just repeat them for me, Arrow in Flight.
And Mary Lavin calls it an arrow in flight.
Yes.
And Kevin Barry, the Irish writer, calls it a high wire act.
It is.
I love that. Chekhov, the shot of vodka.
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember Edgar Allan Poe. Was he the one who said that a novel is a short story padded? He was just so disdainful of novels.
I mean, with the arrow in flight analogy, Namita, where the arrow lands is very important. And in fact, you address that directly in one of your stories. It's a couple of lines. Would you just read that to us? And of course, your book is titled Openings, isn't it? So I mean, openings and closings, both very, very important.
So I think this may have been the first short story I ever wrote, or perhaps the second. And it's when you read it now, because I wrote it maybe 30 years ago, so it's a little time-bound. I don't know how well it's aged. It's about this woman called something or the other who goes to Rishikesh. And it says, a short story is supposed to shut at the end with a sort of satisfactory click. But it would be difficult to distort this tale to fit an artistic requirement. My quarrel with the short story is precisely that it imposes a false order and symmetry on events, forcing impressionable young minds to anticipate a similar state from the inchoate mess that is life. Even Manny agreed in the course of an abstract discussion that a punchline is not always essential to a good denouement. Is that how you say it? Denouement. So that's, the search for an ending. I don't know if some people begin a short story with the end already in mind or whether it goes there. Do you?
Yeah, I think I never begin writing a short story until I have a sense of how it's going to end. I might not know literally in plot terms, but I will feel the place that I want to get to, because I think it's that note that carries on reverberating. That's the most important thing that you need to hit. And I think, in the 19th century, writers like Guy de Maupassant, O. Henry, a short story would be tied up in a bow at the end. There would be that snap, that neat resolution. And then with Chekhov, you start to get this great radical uncertainty of an ending. And we start to get these beautiful open endings. And for me, I always know where I want a short story to feel. I know what I want the reader to feel as it ends. And I'm always I see the movement as a short story as a sort of, it needs to enact a moment of change, of irrevocable change. I think this is why so many debut collections are coming of age stories, because it's so easy to show that, you move from one state to another. But what I'm trying to do in a story is take the story to the moment that the tipping point is inevitable. So something is irrevocably changed. And I think that's why short stories are satisfying for a reader, because you're being taken through this process. And also you have, for me, you're setting up everything in the story is working towards this ending where you have this chance to go somewhere. And the intensity of the story, you can reach a certain height or a frequency or a vibration or a feeling. If you get all the rhythms right and the words right and the emotions flowing right, you can get somewhere really special, maybe vertiginously high at the end.
I mean, Ravi, do you think that they need to snap shut?
No, but I have to confess that I won't name the writer, not that they're here. Very, very, and I love them too. But there have been moments when I'm reading these stories and they're very long. I say, when is this going to end? I thought I was reading a short story. So some people do it successfully. They write mini novels, which are short stories. But them snapping shut, no, not really, because I don't think that would be. Again, if Mom or you're saying Maupassant and the others, if they wrote stories that weren't as neat as they are, I don't know if they would work for me. So it would really depend on the writer. And then there are some short stories, both of them, for instance, I hope many of you will pick up the books if you haven't read them already. There are many stories, but I can tell you that, in both Namita's and in Lucy's books, there are stories which are very intense, which are off the moment, of a certain feeling, but entire lives are kind of sensed in that story. So which is what they do. But to give you another example is, which does something very different, is Peter Carey. He has this collection called Fat Man in History. One of my favorite books ever. It's a collection of short stories, and there's a story there, not the title story, which a lot of people refer to, but another one called Do You Love Me? And, I can't really describe it to you except that, people start disappearing. It starts with a cartographer going and trying to map, that's his job, to map the areas of that particular country, and the areas are disappearing, And then that condition begins to affect people. And you're there sitting, so it ends wonderfully with, I think it's the mother who's disappearing and the son, or it's the other way around. And while they're disappearing, they say, do you love me? And before the question is answered. So there is no snapping shut whether the question was answered, or it's just, you just remember it. It's such a fantastic story. So that's what short stories can do.
Georgina, I wanted to say something about Indian literature in the Indian languages. I'm deeply interested in trying to read and understand what is happening historically also in the Indian languages. And our greatest short story writer ever in India, I think, was somebody called Munshi Premchand. And the stories that he wrote about 150 years ago. He died about 150 years ago. So they are 100 plus years old. And they reverberate at every level today. I can't tell you how many sessions we've had in Jaipur on Munshi Premchand. And the stories just remain as true to India and to individuals. And I don't know what is the magic, but what I do feel is that in every language in India, the short story historically has done better than the novel. The novels are a mess. They try to follow the model of Western, the Englishmen would come and write novels, and then people would try to write like Walter Scott or something like that, and they couldn't. And they were very dull and very boring and haven't aged well. But all the short stories have aged well. Do you agree?
Well, one of my favourite Indian short story writers is Ambai, and in the translations by Lakshmi Holstrom. And I love the story. I think a perfect illustration of this is In the Forest, a Deer. Yes. And that story starts off, it's quite a realistic story, and it's the young children and the person that tells them these stories. And then the story does exactly what I was describing. It goes somewhere so strange and magical and mythical. And we end with this blossoming out of this moonlit image of this deer that's lost its herd and is in the forest, in the moonlight, needing to start imagining a new life for itself. And so that story, it does exactly, it starts off somewhere realist, and then it goes somewhere ghostly and otherworldly that just stays with you. Once you've read that story, I think it will be with you forever.
Namita, I wonder if you might read, actually, the end of a story.
Yes.
Which does something like this. I mean, of course, you won't be able to read the full story, but it's... well, anyway, after she's read it, I'll talk about that.
Let me find it. I thought I had marked it.
It's called The Inner Life of Things. It's...
So there were, the worst stories I ever wrote was when I was a young woman, before I wrote my first novel, Paro. There was some very bad poetry and some very bad short stories. And in fact, when Carmen Carroll bought the Paro, which was my first novel, I was 26. There was a poem at the end of it, and she was very rude, and she said, throw it away and never look at it again. And the same with the short stories. But the stories I wrote during COVID were equally bad, I think. Fortunately, I didn't write any poetry those days. But there's a story called The Inner Life of Things, because I've always been confused by the difference between the animate and the inanimate. To me, everything has its own life. And it's not me projecting it on. I do believe that everything around us is observing, watching, with its own form of consciousness. So this is a story about a stone, and it's called The Inner Life of Things. It's got many subheadings. This is called The Stone. Now the stone has featured in 2 or 3 of the segments before this, but now the stone is telling its own story, and this is what the stone says. Stones don't drown. We belong where we are, above ground, below water, in the depths of the earth. Stones have a language of heat, of warmth, of cold, of ice. We welcome the sun upon us. We embrace the dark. We endure. Rocks and pebbles and grains of sand, we are the same, but the elements have beaten us into different forms and presences. I was a rock then, before the river broke my resistance and shattered the overhang of cliff and claimed it for the element of water. The ceaseless waves, moving and undulating, caressed me tenderly. It was strange to leave the comfort of the water. It had been kind to me. I could tell you all the places where I belonged before I landed in this man's pockets. He understood stones, this I will admit. He was almost a stone himself, in that he knew silence and stillness. Sometimes he held me in the cup of his hand to feel the weight of my being, the pressure of my presence. I'm told in the old days humans knew the silence of stones and could listen to their wisdom. They did not try to shape us into their image. A mother stone told me this. I had rested beside her with a heap of rocks and pebbles not far from the river. Some humans had smeared her with vermilion paste and anointed her as a goddess. They offered flowers to her and lit a lamp before her at dusk, and sometimes at dawn. She was patient with them, although she did not enjoy it. I am clay, shale, and volcanic ash. In my memories, I carry an ancient seafloor. I'm stardust and mica crystals. I have fossils inside me with their own stories, their metamorphic tales. A stone can feel the weight and pressure of everything, of every thought, every object in the universe. It has mass and density. Humans are made mostly of water, and the perception of their body organs is liable to error. I am still and alone, a part of everything. I saved that man from drowning before I left him. I am the heart of stone. Thank you.
Ravi, tell us more about that piece.
No, just very quickly, this is something that Namita, and I don't know, she kind of is dismissive each time I say this, but she is really a true original among writers because the things that she does, I don't think sometimes even she realizes what she's done. And that actually was the first book that I read of hers as an editor. I'd read Paro before that, was Book of Shadows. And I said, where did you get these some parts where a ghost is narrating parts of the. And she said, I don't know, Aleister Crowley came to me in a dream. And Aleister Crowley, he was also a character in the novel. And that's how it happened. She says, I don't know how it happens. Anyway, so in this one, this particular section of the short story is in the voice of a stone. Before that, there are two different men who I thought could even be the same. So she moves from, as she said, the animate to the inanimate, to the inner lives of men, to the inner lives of stone. It's just she manages to do this in many different registers. So that's what I meant, is this, in a short story, she kind of takes you to much, much larger spaces and ideas. But yeah, I mean, if Lucy could read her, excerpt, which I heard earlier, which is also fantastic.
It's lovely because what Lucy's doing here is she's sort of time traveling. You're taking us back to another era.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to read just the first page from a story called Daylight Raids that is set during the London Blitz. I was living in a very bummed out part of East London at the time, and I was thinking about how many of my favourite London writers and Irish London writers like Rosamund Lehman and Elizabeth Bowen and Virginia Woolf and Louis MacNeice and Graham Greene were all great writers of the Blitz. And so I wrote this story, but of course I don't just want to parody a story, there has to be something new to it as well. And so I think India, like Ireland, has a great culture of storytelling and of consciousness of the story being told. And so in this story, you'll hear the reader is conscious of the story being told at the same time as it's happening. So this is Daylight Raids. In a half-ruined house, they are smoking. Look closely. Can you see them? There he stands, his uniform, blue serge with red piping, smeared with soot, the silver buttons dull, all but the one that she touched with her thumb when they met, rubbed in a slow circle clear. His tin hat in his hand, his belt with its spanner and axe. His sandy hair, its glint of red, is damp, still shows the marks of the teeth of the comb. He dunked his head and washed his face in a basin back at the station before coming to meet her. He's been on duty for 48 hours. Now it's his break, 24 hours off. He is exhausted, but it's almost impossible to sleep right after a shift. Most of the other auxiliaries have headed to Soho, to bars with deep cellars to drink themselves blind, but he managed to telephone a message to her to meet him by the Baker Street side of Regent's Park because he wanted... Look. Oh, but look, he's laughing. She has said something unexpected or maybe unintentionally amusing, and it has made him laugh. Self-conscious now, she stands a little straighter. Her dark blue uniform coat and skirt, tie tight at her throat, her own tin hat and handbell neat at her feet. A looking glass on the mahogany bureau is swinging, almost imperceptibly, the liquid tilt of it. I'm sorry, he says. You know I didn't mean... And then he says, oh, Constance. And there is something in the way he says her name that makes her turn to look at him. Constance, he says again. Constance, though to everyone apart from her mother, she's always been Connie, and even to her mother it's usually, oh, Constance dear, one heaved, long-suffering breath. She looks at him, brown eyes frank. She is weighing up what to say, and how, maybe whether or not to say it. Do you think they can feel us watching? I don't think they can. They are too intent on each other. I think it's about to happen. This something that's been so long building, welling up, until it can't be carefully ignored any longer. Thank you.
Thank you. Lucy, within that story, you give us this love affair, but you give us their childhood, you give us a glimpse into their future, you give us so much. And of course, that doesn't come just within that word count. And we were talking earlier, and you were telling me that you write something like 70,000 words, which you then have to reduce down to a fraction of that.
Sometimes, every story is different. There's no formula, which is why it's so exhilarating. And as Namita said, sometimes my story, All the People Were Mean and Bad, which won the BBC award, I thought about that story for a whole year before writing a word. And as soon as I heard the tone of it, I heard that the tone was elegy. I wrote that story in 2 days. And even with Angus, almost a word didn't change. I knew the characters, I knew what they would say. I just was able to catch like a kite, and I just wrote it. Other times stories take much longer. And I finished a story recently that's long for me, about 8,000 words. It's called Hamlet, a love story, about a young experimental theatre troupe putting on a production of Hamlet in New York. And I put together a document that I called Anatomy of a Story for my students to show them what a short story looks like sometimes, from the first notes I made on my iPhone when I had the first glimpse of this story through successive drafts. And that document came to 70,000 words. To put that in context, that's maybe like a 300-page novel. And that's just one story. And so sometimes I think it's easier to write long when you're trying to make everything matter, when you're trying to hone something back, when you're trying to, yes, exactly as you say, Georgina, suggest a whole life and a whole history, but do it with as few words as possible and as lightness a touch as possible. It takes work, and sometimes it takes writing drafts for you to discover it, and then your knowledge of that is somehow present in the text, even if the words don't literally spell it out. It's a mysterious thing.
Now, we know that there are a lot of writers in the audience we've seen from that show of hands, and I'm quite sure that you've got some questions for our panellists. So if you'd like to give us a wave, and we'll send some microphones out to you, this person in the stripes just there, thank you very much. If you'd like to stand, please, so we can just see who we're talking to. I'm sorry, we can't hear you. I don't think it's on. That sounds better.
Hello, can you?
Hi.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm a short story writer too, so I completely get what everybody is suggesting. Although I can't plot for the life of me, I just cannot plot. So my question is, as a short story writer, we write so many drafts. You write like 5-6 drafts, and you revise and you revise. So how do you keep yourself objective and not be so close to the story?
That's a really good point, and I guess part of that is the fact that someone like Ravi then would jump in and be that other set of eyes.
As I just said, I'm not very good at rewriting, revising. I put it away for some time, look at it partly as a reader and partly as the writer, and see if it works. If it doesn't work, sometimes I just put it away again. Because I don't think short stories lend themselves to intensive editing. That's my feeling.
I think that's such a writer's question. It's a really good question. And actually, I do have some advice that might be useful. I got it from Joan Didion, sadly not personally, but from an interview she gave. And she said she retypes everything. And that's become my practice. With every new draft, I print it out, I have it beside me, and I retype it back in. And I think that's because on screen, it already looks too finished, too polished. It's too easy for your eye to slip down the screen, or for you to think this sentence isn't really very good, but it needs to be there, and you let it go past. If you're retyping it in, it's harder for bad words and to get past you, but also I feel it allows the story a provisionality right up until the last moment, because suddenly your characters might start doing or saying something under your fingertips that they've never done, that they couldn't have said 2 or 3 drafts ago because you didn't know them well enough, and you can just follow that. And if it doesn't work, you just, cut, paste, delete, go back to your words. But I think for me, that's a way of keeping the story radically provisional and alive right up until the very end. So see if that works for you.
That's really valuable advice, and I'm going to take it to heart. But I do anyway, type and retype, but you're right.
Another question from the audience. So we have one just here by the aisle. Do we have a microphone is being run to you as we speak? Ravi, just before we get on to this question, this thing of deciding what stays and what goes, I wonder how much power you have. If your writer is saying, no, actually, I love it, do you let them keep it? Can they kill their babies?
Oh, yes, they can. Fortunately, that hasn't really happened to me. I've just been fortunate that the authors that I've worked with have always... They need to be convinced that that you get the story and that you respect what they're trying to do and understand it, and then they don't really resist what you're saying. This author who's I love, and he's also a friend, and Upamanyu Chatterjee is famously resistant to any suggestions. Even he's come around. So,
Yeah, I think as well, when Namita says that she sometimes doesn't know what she's doing, I think that that's not a false modesty. I think that sometimes we need to not know because we don't know with our logical brains, but there is something deeper.
We are accessing another space.
We're accessing another space. And sometimes we need to not look at that too logically or too closely because we'll get scared. And then an editor's role is to look at it and try to understand it logically.
Yeah.
The questioner is waiting for us.
Yeah. Am I audible? Yeah. So, as an aspiring short story writer, it's absolutely heartbreaking to see that short stories get really picked up. I mean, if you see agenting guidelines, I don't know if it's an Indian phenomenon, if it's a global thing, they call it the short story curse, they'll treat it as pariahs. So what's your point of view on this?
Ravi, can we start with you on that?
No, so this is something I did want to mention, is that, and it isn't just agents and publishers. It is, to begin with, fiction is privileged over non-fiction when it comes to awards and reviews. And then in fiction, it's a novel that's privileged over. And you've heard 2 writers tell you just how much it takes to produce a really good short story. And so short story collections don't even qualify for awards. So, it begins there. It's not just agents, publishers, it's just generally, I don't know. And the traditional wisdom in publishing is that, short stories after poetry and plays are the most difficult to sell short story collections. And I've never really understood that as a buyer, as a publisher, and somebody who knows writers, because, attention spans, not only now, but always have been short, and some people, prefer to read short works. So I don't know why that is the case. And I don't think it's the case only in India. It's everywhere. That's the case. But then you publish it, and you're surprised sometimes. So I don't think that's true. It's just people are stupid.
Well, I think you've got a wonderful chance to prove that you're not stupid, because immediately the session ends, both authors will be signing copies of their short stories. So I urge you to prove the point wrong and pick up the books and, in fact, get them signed by the authors.
What may make sense is this: many publishers and agents may also have told you, is that try and make it a collection of somehow linked stories. And I don't think you should dismiss that advice. It is useful, because what can happen sometimes is that unless you're a really, really good writer, not all your stories are equally good. So in a collection, or you're trying to do just too many different things, and that can be disorienting for a reader. So maybe that's one way to kind of subvert this whole thing about, this is not a novel, and so therefore you do linked. And the link can be very tenuous. It doesn't matter. But it's worth trying that, I think.
Please do have a look at these very, very beautiful books. They are Openings and Life on Mars by our very talented authors here. We've got a very, 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 very short question, please. We've got to end.
Very short question. But I'd like to say something before that. I wrote a novel, and Ravi was my editor. He did a magnificent job. Ravi has a reputation of being the best editor in India. And
Bhaijan, you know, I would say I would give you drinks, but you give such good drinks and cocktails. I'll come over for more drinks and
No,
cocktails.
he
Thank you.
he was wonderful, and it's available here in the bookshop across the river. But my question is this: when I was passing the manuscript around, one publishing house told me novels don't sell anymore, and that's why they liked the novel, but they rejected it because they don't sell. Is that true?
Bhaijan, we'll have to, this is a very long question. It will need a whole session to itself. So I think in your session today, which is the last session of the day at 5 o'clock, we'll discuss that. Okay?
But to respond to the previous question, I think as we've all said, if you fall in love with a short story, you don't get a choice. You know, it's a mysterious form, it's a magical form, it's a form that truly rewards devotion. So I think if you feel that the short story is your form, you can't listen to market forces, you can't try to second guess them. You've just got to follow that star and write the stories and read the stories and do, you know, it's short stories, not my novels, that have brought me here today. And there are readers for them. And I think you have to trust that if you do your bit of the work, your short stories will find their readers.
Thank you very much. Namita, thank you, Lucy, Ravi. It's been an absolute joy to speak to you. And as I say, if you haven't had an opportunity to ask your question, you can do so because the authors will be signing their books and you can ask them in person. Very many thanks to you all.
Thank you, Georgina.